All right, so it's a Monday, and on Mondays we get you a very special segment of Meet Your Fund Manager. And today the fund in concern is the category is PSU equity funds, and for that we'll be talking to Anand Sharma, Fund Manager, ICICI Prudential Mutual Fund. Anand, good evening and welcome to the show. So we'll be talking everything about PSU equity theme, but before that, I really want to. We will get into nitty-gritties of your fund also, and we'll talk more on your strategy and exposure. But before that, let's lay down a basic understanding of this particular sector that we are referring. What does it involve, and what type of companies are we talking about? What kind of market exposure are we talking about in general as a category?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, thank you so much for having me on your show. It's a pleasure. Uh, so if you talk about this category, right? So as the name itself suggests, PSU, essentially these are companies where either the central government of India or the state government of India has a significant say in running of operations on a day-to-day basis, right? So that is the basic definition as far as a public sector enterprise is concerned. Now, actually, if you look at it, although the name suggests public sector enterprise, the beauty about this entire theme of PSU is that it is present across various sectors, right? Now, if you just broadly look at all the sectors where PSUs have presence, and it's just phenomenal, right? But if you start off with a sector like power, right? A large part of power sector in India is controlled by the public sector enterprises. If you look at a large segment like say an oil and gas, we all know that both as far as the upstream and the downstream companies in the oil and gas sector are concerned, many of them are PSUs. PSUs also are very big in the financial segment, right? When you look at banks, when you look at life insurance companies, a few general insurance companies, power financiers, right? Apart from that, there are many other sectors where PSUs are present, like logistics, metals and mining, fertilizers, railways, etc. Right? So it's not a narrow theme which is just comprised of a few stocks and sectors. It's actually a very wide theme wherein the government of India, through its central government and state government, has a significant exposure on a day-to-day running basis.
Sure, very well explained, Anand. But then I also want to, I want you to help our viewers understand, because you're talking about PSU stocks and companies. It's a very wide theme and a category across sectors, as rightly explained by you. But then I want to understand what kind of investors should be investing in this type of category. People who really bank or believe in the growth story of PSU companies, or maybe investors who don't have a very high appetite of risk in terms of putting their money in private companies. Although you're putting money in equity, there is some kind of putting money in share market, some kind of risk is definitely there. But then, there's a comfort factor when we say, oh, it's a government-based company or it's a PSU company. So how would you like to explain the investor profile that should be putting their money in this particular category?
Sure. I think first and foremost, one of the advantages that public sector enterprise enjoys is that typically, PSUs have this rules that they are supposed to pay a certain amount of, cash flow that they generate in the form of dividends or buybacks to shareholders. So typically, that is one advantage that PSUs have always enjoyed. Also, because of the fact that they are sovereign entities, you typically don't tend to worry too much about aspects like, say, a cost of borrowing or other factors, right? So I think those are a couple of inherent advantages that PSUs typically tend to enjoy. Now, historically, if you look at PSUs, I think one of the aspects that people have always looked at for investing in PSUs is just people tend to look at the dividends that a PSU tends to offer. But actually, if you break it down, right, and if you go back into history, PSUs have always tended to do well when the business environment for those PSUs in which they operate in, they are on an improving trajectory, right? So from a risk profile perspective, I think first and foremost, it's a thematic fund. Even though PSU covers a lot of sectors, so to that extent, the exposure that any individual would want to have in their in their stock market portfolio. Obviously, it cannot be a very, very high exposure. And people should bet on PSUs only if they are bullish on the growth story of India, right? It should never be a short-term 1 year or 2 year call. It has to be a long-term call where the business fundamentals of the PSUs, if they are on an improving trajectory, then obviously those particular sectors and stocks can tend to do well. If the fundamentals are definitely not going to be good, then whether it is a PSU or a private company, it's unlikely to do well from an investor perspective.
All right, Anand, let's also shift focus to your specific fund, ICICI Pru PSU Equity Fund, and the kind of sector allocation that we're also looking at is power has almost 20%, banks 18%, oil 10%, petroleum products around 8%, consumable fuels around 7%, insurance 3%. So I really want to understand your sector allocation and the kind of bet you are playing on it. You know, power has the maximum bet placed over here. So what is the strategy across sectors and, you know, behind selecting these companies also of these specific sectors?
Sure. So essentially, when we look at PSU as a sector, right, the first thing actually you have to do is, you have to break it down into two components. Okay, so the first and foremost, there is a domestic cyclical component in which you are entirely betting on the growth story of India. And the second part of the portfolio is a global cyclical component. Now, let me spend some time on explaining both of these two facets. If you look at the domestic cyclical component, right, as you rightly said, right, there are sectors like power, financials, logistics, which are essentially a play on the domestic economy doing well, and those particular sub-segments also doing well. And then also in PSUs, you have a global perspective as well, right? For example, if you look at a sector like oil and gas, no matter what we might want to say, the prices of oil are not necessarily determined by what happens inside the country. The prices of oil are in a lot of ways determined by global geopolitics. We've seen in the last 2 years how geopolitics has influenced the prices of oil, how they've gone up and down depending on how geopolitical escalations have happened across the globe. And also the other major sector, which is in a big way linked to what happens across the globe, is metals. So essentially, if you break down PSUs, there is a basket of domestic cyclicals and there is a global cyclicals. So at this point of time, our positivity is more towards the domestic cyclical part of the economy, wherein obviously a sector like power and a sector like financials play a very important part. Now, if you simply look at power, for example, right, a sector, there are a lot of fundamental changes that have happened for the good in this sector for the last maybe 6, 7 years or so. 6, 7 years back, we all used to hear about the problems in the power sector, the problems that various discoms are facing. I think many of those problems have definitely been ironed out and have improved. So today you have a situation where India, as the economy is beginning to do well, and hopefully it continues to do well. Power is a very important part of the economy. So as typically power demand and the economic growth of the country tends to get interlinked in a very high correlation. And I think unfortunately what you will also see in the next 2, 3 years is that the demand for a sector like power, right, it's growing at a certain rate, whereas capacity, it doesn't get added so quickly. If you want to add capacities in thermal power or renewable power, it takes some
Right.
time. So there's a demand supply mismatch. So that's why power as a
Exactly.
sector
Yeah.
looks good.
So, Anand, I also want to understand your interest in aerospace and defense. You know, no doubt this sector is gaining momentum. Okay, we've seen the triggers that most of the companies related to this sector have performed. But how bullish are you on this sector? And going ahead, do you see your exposure going up in aerospace and defense?
So as far as aerospace and defense, right? I mean, defense as a category, in the last 2 years, because of all the geopolitical issues that the world has been facing, I don't think as a country, we or any other country rather have a choice but to spend on defense or to increase their spend on defense. So I think so theoretically, over the next few years, over the next decade or so, what you're going to see is definitely India will have to spend on defense a significant amount, and we also need to catch up with the global players on our defense spending. So I think as far as that aspect is concerned, I don't see a challenge. The only challenge that this aerospace and defense as a theme faces is that the number of investable stocks is slightly limited. So from a valuation perspective, maybe what we are beginning to see is that there is some amount of valuation discomfort that we are beginning to see. But from a thematic perspective, I don't see a challenge in this aerospace and defense as a theme for the next 7, 8 years at least. So I think that the call for us will essentially always be as far as valuations are concerned.
Sure. Anand, are you fully invested or are you also sitting on cash?
So as far as our published portfolio is concerned, we have raised some cash in the last few months or so, and the reason for that has been basically wherever we felt that there have been pockets of discomfort in valuations, we've preferred to raise some cash.
Right. Talking about exposure in terms of market caps, how would you like to explain that exposure to us across large, mid cap, and small cap categories in
Uh,
these specific sectors?
So again, if I just look at our published portfolio, what you will see is that two-thirds of this portfolio is in large caps, right? And I think essentially, if you look at this theme, this will always be a slightly large cap dominated portfolio, primarily because of the fact that a lot of the large companies which are there in PSUs and which have large market shares in various industries that they are present in, they are essentially a large cap. So this will always be a large cap dominated portfolio.
Okay. Anand, where all valuations you think in a couple of quarters would just cross that threshold of being in the comfortable area? So far, the valuations that you have, so far the exposure as per the valuations that you have in the portfolio are how comfortable in what sectors? And maybe going down, in 2, 3 quarters, you might just want to trim down your exposure because of valuation being unrealistic.
Uh, so I think first and foremost, when you ask about next couple of quarters, we also need to understand that right now at this point of time we have general elections going on in this country. We are only done with two phases, and in the next month or so, the results for the general elections will also be out. So I think there, what you can also expect is that over the next maybe month or a quarter, right? I think you can also tend to expect some volatility in this theme generally. From a sectoral perspective, the two sectors where we definitely have had most comfort is definitely power and oil and gas as a theme. Definitely, these are the two sectors where we have most comfort today in this theme. And there are obviously certain sectors which we are also, on the lookout always to, invest as long as valuations get comfortable.
See, because it's a very sector-specific fund, and the kind of sectors you have and the companies you have, it's quite possible that a pure equity fund, maybe a large cap, might be having a lot of these companies in the portfolio also. So if one wants to include a PSU equity fund, what should be the portfolio strategy in terms of allocation to this particular fund, considering that one might have a basic and a core portfolio already laid down?
I think it's a very, very valid question. This is definitely a thematic fund. And generally, we as a house have always believed that asset allocation is a very, very important part of any investor's corpus. So, keeping that aspect in mind, we would definitely urge people to have any kind of thematic portfolio, whether it is a PSU fund or any other theme. I think it should definitely have a smaller part of any investor's investable corpus, because I think one of the challenges sometimes that a thematic fund might face is entry and exit can become important, right? I mean, we've seen in the past sometimes thematic funds, if not entered and exited at the right times, have probably investor experience has not been great. So I think the urge that we would give people is that anybody who wants to have exposure should look at it as a thematic fund with a smaller portion of their investable corpus.
Right. One last question and then we'll wrap up the
Yeah,
discussion also. What should be the
sure.
return expectation from an investor from this category?
I think that's the trickiest part to give a return expectations. It's very tricky. I think there are too many
Sure.
moving parts right now, not just in India but across the globe as well.
Mm-hmm. Time frame to be in this fund should be more than 5 years?
Definitely, it has to be a long-term
Sure.
oriented fund.
Sure, sure. All right, Anand, thank you so much for being on the show today and explaining our viewers everything about PSU equity funds. Thank you so much.